Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. Andrew Cheetle. I teach at Liverpool Hope in the areas of pastoral theology. And for many years, I've been interested in the Acts of the Apostles, particularly focused on this in my master's research. And I've been asked to share with you some of my thinking on this book and some of my research I've been doing through the years. I find it a fascinating book of the Bible and one that to this day is still giving lots of new insights to scholars. So I'm going to share with you my PowerPoint. So the Acts of the Apostles, an introduction. Now I'm going to be doing this in two parts. So after about 15 slides, I've put in a break, and it gives you the opportunity to pause, get yourself a cup of tea. And I've also asked at that point if you would read through some chapters of Acts that will help you in the second part of the presentation. So the Acts of the Apostles. Through the years, there have been quite a lot of what we call ecclesial functions of the book of Acts. You may know some of them yourselves to support particular views of ministry. You know, whether it's apostolic ministry, we look at how the disciples become leaders of the church. We see in the early chapters of Acts how problems arose with the apostles, the disciples in particular, being overwhelmed with the amount of need. And so deacons were appointed. And we sometimes trace back these ideas that we find in our churches today to the Acts of the Apostles. I would say more recently, throughout the world, I suppose it's more known, the book of Acts, for charismatic theology and how charismatics and Pentecostals trace their spirituality and their religious experiences to things like Acts chapter 2 and other parts of Acts where it seems miraculous things occur. So it becomes a kind of proof text, almost, this book, for that kind of spirituality. When I was an undergraduate, the big thing that was being used, Acts was being used for, was modeling church growth. So many of the church growth books, the hundreds that came out in the 80s and 90s, always went back to the book of Acts and said, oh, look, here's a pattern. This is how the disciples did it. This is how the church grew. And almost proof texting from Acts. And if we did that in our church today, we would get growth. You still hear some of these notions. Others use the book of Acts to prove the lives or the historicity of the apostles and the spread of mission throughout the world. So we follow Acts and say, you know, this is the historical roots of the apostles. And there are probably many other ways in which the book of Acts has been used. In 1973, the famous scholar Van Eunik came with this phrase, this oft quoted phrase in a paper he gave, a storm center in contemporary scholarship. So that's going back to 1973, 50 odd years ago now. And still, the Acts of the Apostles, but in a different way, is causing lots of debates among scholars. And one of the new ones is what the dating of Acts is. And we're not going to go into that today. It's too complex. But a number of scholars are now thinking Acts could have been quite early, even around the time of Paul's death, which goes against lots of scholarship that's gone on before. But the Acts of the Apostles seems to contain so many areas that lead to this storm. So let's look at some of these and what Van Eunik really was referring to and what became a big debate within the study of Acts. And most of this related to how we should understand the book of Acts. There were many differing opinions among scholars about how to interpret it. And particularly Germanic scholars, those with roots in German scholarship, biblical scholarship, were quite skeptical of the historical nature or the historicity of Acts. And throughout the centuries, it was often presumed that Luke was the first Christian historian and that the Acts of the Apostles was history. And the German scholars were very skeptical of this. They may have admired Luke for his creative storytelling and that he had a theological agenda, but really felt that there's very little historical accuracy or historicity in the books. And even that many of the episodes were literary fiction composed by an author who wasn't probably the companion of Paul. So kind of quite skeptical of the older tradition. And I've put here some of the books that have come out recently, so you can look at these. These are very famous books, particular Ernst Henschen's book, The Acts of the Apostles. And on we go. So another part of the storm was some felt that, particularly Protestants, felt that Luke was a perverter of the theologies of both Paul and the Jerusalem church, because particularly of Paul, there was too much emphasis in Luke, it seems, of doing the right thing. We get this also in Luke's gospel, which is also written by the author. And so they felt it's got like an early Catholic notion of the importance of discipleship or doing over and above what they would think of Paul as a message of justification by faith, which is really a Reformation understanding of Paul. So Luke's perspective on history and theology was frequently compared and contrasted with that of Paul, generally to Luke's disadvantage, that whatever Luke's got to say has to be subservient to Paul. And this is at the time where Paul was being read through these kind of Reformation glasses. So another key notion is that Luke reflects more a preacher of the theology of glory. This is the Luther's theology here, where he criticizes, the issue of works righteousness, trying to please God by our actions, rather than the theology of the cross, the necessity of Christ's death as the only means of our salvation. And so Protestant scholars were seeing in Luke this tendency in Acts and Luke to stress the importance of doing and following and actions rather than the meritorious death of Christ as the key thing. So arguments were used and are still used in New Testament studies about the credibility of Acts of the Apostles, and would say that where Acts of the Apostles diverges, for example, from Paul about Paul's actions and what Paul did, we must always go to what Paul says, because Paul's the first-hand person and would obviously know better. I think there's a lot of scope to criticize that about, is the person the best judge of what happened? Anybody who's been around for a long time in their lives, like me, will say sometimes you're the worst person to remember detail, and sometimes it's others who've got better recollections. So I'm not completely buying into that criticism, although it may have some truth. So it's carried on throughout the study of the Acts of the Apostles, a kind of Paul versus Luke ideology. So you get typical questions in this about Galatians chapter 2 and Acts chapter 15. Are they the same thing? Are they different? And often people favoring Paul's notions in Galatians 2. So let's look at what I would call prolegomena, which for me means things we need to say before we really get into the meat of it. Some key points of which help us interpret the book of Acts. And the first one is Acts and its role in the New Testament canon. So it's in our Bibles. It follows the Gospel of John, and it precedes the writings of Paul. It's been thought of for many centuries as the first Christian history, not Eusebius, and it kind of has that function in the canon. Now, scholarship, as I've said, is divided about its value as history. So the skeptical ones typically are German with a particular approach. All of the West Art Institute, the Jesus Seminar, follow some of the same ideas. Interestingly, though, on the other side of scholarship, you have the kind of Anglo-American, with a few French people thrown in to keep us happy, have had a more positive way of looking at Acts and see Acts as carrying quite a lot of historical fact, but perhaps presented in a first century historiography way of presenting history, and that we need to understand how history was written at this time, and that in that context it could be called a history. Gerhard Schneider in 1980 and 82 in the two-volume work Die Apostelgeschichte kind of does a compromise approach and sees why things can be skeptical, but at the same time sees history in this book. So carrying on, again, some books on your right there. Prolegomena continued. I think we have to see Acts now that although it's in the canon prior to Paul's work, it's best not to read it as an introduction to Paul, which is kind of the way it's worked within the canon. And neither should it be seen through the Pauline theology. So people will say, okay, well, where Acts differs, then we take Paul's view and we read Paul before we read Acts. And I don't think we need either when we read Acts of the Apostles, in the first instance, to try and harmonize Paul's own accounts of his life, his work or his theology, with what the writer of Acts is saying. You know, when Acts has this common phrase, and they return to Jerusalem, and it has Paul returning to Jerusalem numerous times, whereas Paul doesn't say it very often. Who's right, who's wrong? I don't think we need to try and harmonize. I think we should see these books on their own terms. So in that notion, I think we need to set Acts free from its canonical constraints. It's placed where it is. It has functioned in this way to introduce Paul, but let's read Luke Acts on its own terms. Two books, Luke and Acts, by the same author, to the same recipient. It constitutes a distinct body of writing with its own agenda and theology. So I've even said before, you know, let's get a Stanley knife and let's take out the Gospel of John, put that somewhere else, like with the joining writings, and let's read Luke and Acts together. Would it then have more of a theological impact on the church than it does now with it being separated? And, you know, it is together 27.5% of the New Testament, by far the largest. So Luke, whoever Luke is the largest contributor to our New Testament. And I think we need to be taking this body of work seriously about what it says. So Luke Acts, two volumes, as we've said. We know it's the same author. It seems to be, as it says in both books. Same recipient. Has continuing story and themes that overlap and follow on from each other. The writer sees himself as some kind of historian and, you know, says at the beginning of the book of Luke that he's kind of had that agenda. But he's also, you know, a theologian. He's got something to say about who Christ is, what his mission is, and what the disciples' mission is. And if you take the two books as a whole, there seems to be a historical and theological circle. So, in a sense, the book kicks off really with Caesar Augustus and the census, so a proclamation in Rome, and we end in Acts with the gospel in Caesar's household in Rome. So you kind of get a full circle, and the books are constructed using journeys as a central literary method. So Luke, as opposed to every other book, and Acts have constant journeys through them, and it's easy to go through with a highlighter and underline these. So, a typical one we forget in Luke's gospel is Mary and Joseph and Jesus going down to Jerusalem when he was just a boy. That's a journey where they go down there and then they set off back, and then they have to come back and to find Jesus, and they go back. Journeys throughout both books. So how do we then interpret Acts of the Apostles? And I think it's important then, if we know that Luke's gospel is the first book, then let's look how Luke is setting up this narrative. So how does he do that? And it seems pretty clear that for Luke, with the birth of Jesus, with his role as a servant Messiah, that he's a spirit-appointed prophet who his ministry is confirmed by miracles. He heals, he casts out demons, he forgives sins. Through his ministry, the servant Messiah of Jesus, a new age is dawning, a new age in God's mission with Israel, really. So Jesus' spirit-empowered ministry, and then we get then to kind of how Luke has a particular method. He confirms it at nodal points, particular points where the spirit is emphasized. So we get the birth, the baptism, the transfiguration, his death and resurrection, and ascension are kind of places where we stop up for a longer bit of narrative, and the spirit is central to this. And what is going on is that the new age of the spirit that's being shown here by Luke is explaining that God's plan for Israel, his plan of salvation, is extending outwards. So in Luke's gospel, it expands to the poor, the sick, the tax collectors, publicans, sinners, pagans, women, Samaritans, and it goes on. It's kind of spreading out to those who would be considered on the periphery or even outside of Israel. And that's being set up in the Gospel of Luke. And it's quite different to the other two synoptic Gospels at that point. It stresses it. So these themes from the third Gospel are then carried over into the book of Acts. So Jesus' concluding message in the Gospel, where he says, go into the whole world and preach the Gospel, starting at Jerusalem, becomes the programmatic imperative in Acts. It also becomes like the table of contents. If you read Acts 1:8, go into all the world, starting Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And then Acts of the Apostles actually follows that scheme and goes from Jerusalem through major Roman cities and ends in Rome in that sequence: Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth. And the spirit-filled mission of Jesus that we saw in Acts of the Apostles is clearly handed down to his disciples. So the text of Acts of the Apostles is extremely missiological. It's the missio Dei, God's mission to the world. And again, the Holy Spirit's activity is emphasized at nodal points. So it's the narrative stops up and we get a story, a longer story, where the Spirit is emphasized. And in the Acts of the Apostles, these are the day of Pentecost, the Samaritan Pentecost in Acts 8, the conversion of Paul Acts 9, the Gentile Pentecost, Acts 10 and 11, and this later on one, Acts 19, 1 to 7, these Ephesian disciples who are discovered by Paul. So it's a fascinating book, isn't it? It's a book of journey. It's a book of missionary journeys. And it seems obvious when reading it, Luke's narrative rests firmly in first century geopolitical times. There are references to main cities, travel routes in the Western Mediterranean that were known, and the narrative stops off in key places, which now become favorite places, where I've been some of these, for pilgrimage. So Antioch I think it's now in Turkey, isn't it? And then Antioch in Pisidia, Ephesus, Perga, Corinth, Thessalonica, Philippi, and on we go. And then the narrative concludes in Rome, completing the circle that we started in Luke's gospel. So and it is full of these wonderful journey narratives. So just to show you on the screen, a typical thing here, this is a Roman trade network in 180 AD, so 100 years later probably from when Acts was written, but based on the same routes, you've got these places that Paul went and that referred to some of them in Acts of the Apostles. So Luke's historiographical method for Acts comprises, as we've said, an overarching missiological scheme with the missionary journeys, the extension of God's promises to Israel to those outside, so going out to the Gentile world. There are geographical indicators, so Jerusalem, major cities and regions and trade routes, and the full circle to Rome. And then, this other emphasis that comes in, the pneumatological, the stress on the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is being poured out, and we see that at key points where the narrative stops up, Acts 8, 9, 10, and 19. And I've called these the Spirit passages, and we'll be looking at those in a short while. Another key feature of the Acts of the Apostles are these speeches, key speeches. There are 36 in total, and I've put the main ones on the screen. Peter at Pentecost, you'll have known that one. Stephen's speech, so you get stoned for that. Peter's speech in Cornelius' house. Peter's speech to the circumcision party. Paul's speech at Antioch of Pisidia. I think that's his first major speech. Peter and James at Jerusalem gathering. The famous speech of Paul in the Areopagus in Athens, and the speeches of Paul at his trials. And these are all very famous and often preached from, and the key ones out of the 36. So let's take a short break there. Get yourself a cup of tea. And before you continue, take a break and please read these chapters. So Acts chapter 8, 9, 10, and 11, before you carry on with the rest of the PowerPoint. We'll just pause it there.